All right, welcome to the last breakout session. Woo, you almost made it. So this one is about niche and non-feeding relationships. So even though I'm going to mention predator and prey for just a little bit, most of what we're going to focus on has nothing to do with eating of one organism over another. And then niche is something that is somewhat intuitive, yet I'm sure you've never heard the term. So let's dive into niche first, since that's going to be probably the most new. All right, so what is it? So every single organism has a niche. That niche is made up of both physical and biological conditions, from what the organism does to when it does it to how it does it. Think of it kind of like a job for the organism. So you may or may not have a job, but your job, or if you have one, or the people you know who have one, obviously your parents, they have multifacets to their job. Where they go to work, maybe they work from home, maybe they go to an office, maybe they go to a hospital, what they do when they're there, the tools that they need to do their job. So it's kind of what a niche is for an organism. So that can include things that it eats, how it eats its food, anything that tries to eat it, physical conditions, from things like temperature to the type of plants that it might need to be around, the water level that it needs. Obviously, that's really critical if it's aquatic or semi-aquatic and lives part of its life or all of its life in the water. When and how it reproduces, organisms it interacts with, or competes with. So niche is really everything. If you're going to describe that organism and everything about it and what it does, that's what its niche is. Okay. Another rule. Yeah, we had the rule of 10 in the first breakout session. Now we have the competitive exclusion principle. So what this essentially says is no two organisms can have the exact same niche. Not the exact same, not on every level. Because if you think about it, if two organisms have the exact same niche, there's going to be a high level of competition between those organisms. So much so that eventually one is going to outcompete the other in some way, shape, or form. Maybe a physical adaptation that lets them do that better. So eventually they're going to outcompete that organism, and they're going to be the ones with that niche and not the other organism. So though temporarily there might be an overlap, eventually competition is going to lead to only one organism occupying that niche. And that could be true if only one thing is different. So for instance, maybe an organism lives in the same environment, eats the same food, but let's say a bird on a tree. Maybe one species occupies the top part of the tree, maybe the other species occupies the lower half of the tree. So they've divided up where they're hunting for food. So now there's a change in their niche. Okay, so we think about a squirrel. Squirrel is something that everybody can generally relate to. So think about, what biome does a squirrel live in? Okay, generally forest, but they've adapted pretty well to human habitats, but they do need trees. Okay, trees are pretty important. When are they active? Generally during the day. Squirrels aren't usually super active at night. They obviously would prefer a climate that is moderate in temperature. I mean, they have fur to protect them from colder temps. They don't hibernate, so they can survive cooler temps. They don't really care about the amount of sun. They're going to need water. You think about what they eat. So we could keep going to all these parts of a niche that we could define the squirrel by. Okay, so now on to the species interactions that don't directly involve eating each other. So you might want to stop and think for a minute, how else do organisms interact? Are those negative? Are they positive? A little bit of both? Maybe negative for one, positive for another? So if you take a second to think about how organisms interact when it doesn't involve eating, maybe you can think of some examples that fall into these three categories. Okay, the one we always think of first is predator-prey. We talked about that back in breakout session 1. It's pretty obvious that the predator gets a benefit, the prey not so much because it gets eaten. But we want to go beyond that. Okay, we want to look beyond the food. Okay, we talked about the lynx and the hare, and we looked at this graph in breakout session 1. So, a couple questions for you. If you had to classify this as a predator or prey, What would you say? Probably imagine everyone knows there's a Venus flytrap. Maybe you've never seen one before. Think about predator-prey. Think about this is a feeding relationship. Does that trap, does it eat the insect? Is there a digestive tract? Really, it doesn't eat it. It dissolves it. And it's going to absorb some minerals out of it. Why does it do that? Because it lives in an environment with not so great soil. And it can't always get the minerals that it needs out of the soil that it lives in. So this was an adaptation to help it survive. Also, really cool species of interest if you haven't picked the plant yet. All right, so not really a predator. What about this? Do you see it in the tree? That's obviously just a joke. All right, on to the non-feeding relationships. All of these non-feeding relationships that we're going to talk about are called symbiotic relationships. Why are they called symbiotic? Because the organisms that we're going to talk about live so closely with each other, they affect each other. So if you remove one, you're going to have a serious impact on the other. So these are closely tied together even though there's no eating going on. They fall into three categories: parasitism, mutualism, commensalism, with parasitism probably being the one you're most familiar with. So that's what we're going to start with. All right, a parasite obviously feeds on an organism. You're thinking, wait a minute, Schreiber, you said we're not talking about feeding relationships. Well, they don't eat the organism. They steal some of its bodily fluids usually. So the big difference here between a feeding and a non-feeding relationship is this parasite is not going to directly kill the host, is what we would call who it's feeding on. Why not? Well, that's counterintuitive. If it kills the host, it loses its host, it loses its food stream. So generally, though it's taking some nutrients, it's not killing the host. Now, there are rare cases because sometimes parasites carry diseases. So that can be a little bit trickier if the disease gets passed from the parasite to the host. Then there's a chance that the host could die. But as a general rule, the parasite itself does not do it directly. All right, what are some examples? The mosquito here, I'm sure everyone's familiar with. They've probably been a host to that parasite before. This one you might not realize what it is. This is actually heartworms. So if you have a dog or a cat and you give them heartworm pills, this is what you're trying to prevent against. Okay, the next one is mutualism. So if you think about that word, mutual, right, you're both getting something out of it. So these are interactions where both species are benefiting from interacting with each other. Anything you thought of earlier maybe fit into this category? Let's take a look at two. So two of these up here, I imagine everyone has seen Finding Nemo. So there's our clownfish with his sea anemone. How is that mutualistic? Well, the clownfish actually gets scraps of food and protection from living in and around the sea anemone. Okay, and the clownfish cleans the sea anemone. So I don't know if you remember that scene in Nemo where they had to kind of clean up before he could leave. Well, that's the benefit that the clownfish provides to the sea anemone, keeping it actually clean. And then of course the bee and the flower with pollination. All right, the last one, this one's a little strange and slightly debated. So this one means that one organism is benefiting and the other one doesn't really care. It's not positive, it's not negative. Okay, so commensalism. Now, why is this debated? Well, can there really be no benefit or no harm to that organism? Is it really completely neutral on one side? That's where the debate lies. So let's look at a couple of examples. All right, so we have a whale with some barnacles on it. I don't know if you can see that in the picture. And so those barnacles grow on the whale and the whale moves them around and it allows them to get food being moved through the water like that. As material passes by them, they're able to pull food out of the water. So there's an obvious benefit to the barnacle, but you might be asking yourself, well, do they hurt the whale? Does it cause harm, like growing on them like that? So that's where this commensalism debate comes in. Obviously a little difficult to study these large whales with barnacles on them in the wild. So do we really know if there's no positive or negative to the whale? Again, that's where the debate comes in. Next example, this is a cattle egret, the bird, standing up here, and obviously Cow. This is Iowa. Most of us have seen a cow. So what's the relationship here? The cattle egret is actually going to pull bugs and insects off and around the cow. So if you've ever seen cows, especially maybe in an area in the summer, a lot of flies around, they're constantly being bombarded by those flies and trying to swat at them. That's obviously pretty annoying. And flies can actually do damage. So the cattle egret's going to sit there and free meal all the insects it can grab out of the air. So obvious benefit to the cattle egret. The cow, well, you could imagine that if those insects could cause damage, there is kind of an indirect benefit to the cow to have that cattle egret pulling them out of the air. So that covers niche and then our non-feeding interactions, symbiotic relationships. We've got mutualism, commensalism, parasitism, and we even did a little bit of review of predator-prey. So you should be ready now to take the last roadblock so that you can then get started on Tier 2.